You think being an electrician is all about burnt wires, exploding panels, and the kind of stuff that looks genuinely dangerous, right? No, the hardest part is the customers. In this video, you're about to hear 31 complaints so ridiculous electricians have to stand there for a few seconds just to process their emotions first. Some people are absolutely convinced the outlet is definitely broken but forgot to turn the switch on. Some believe stronger electricity will make the Wi-Fi faster. And some genuinely think fixing the electrical system will make the house cooler. The common thread is not that they were wrong. It's that they were wrong with terrifying confidence. And somehow the electrician still has to show up, look at the scene, and fix things that really should not even exist. Trust me, the further this goes, the harder it gets to believe. Story 1. The outlet started sparking because the customer tried to cool it down with water. One customer called in almost full panic, saying the kitchen outlet was shooting sparks like fireworks and that there had to be a serious electrical problem. At first, that sounded completely reasonable. But when the electrician arrived, the first thing he noticed was the outlet was soaking wet. Not from a leak, not from rain, but because the homeowner had poured water into it himself. The reason was very simple. He felt the outlet was hot and figured the most logical solution was to cool it down the same way you would put a drink in the fridge. The problem is, electricity does not follow kitchen logic. When asked why he did that, the customer answered with surprising confidence, "I was just trying to help it cool off." Turns out the only thing overheating in this situation was his confidence. And if you think this is already hard to believe, the next story gets even more hands-on. Story 2. The breaker kept tripping because the customer taped it in place. One customer called in with a very annoyed tone, saying the electrical panel in the house had a serious problem because it kept shutting itself off, and it was obviously because the electrician had installed it wrong. At first, that sounded reasonable. But when the electrician opened the panel, he had to stand there for a few seconds just to understand what he was looking at. Every single breaker had been tightly taped into the on position. The homeowner confidently explained that if the breaker could not flip down, then the power would not get cut off anymore. On the surface, that logic almost makes sense. In a deeply dangerous way. In reality, the breaker was not broken. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do, protect the system from overload. But with one roll of tape, the homeowner had completely disabled that protection. They did not fix the electricity. They just made everything stay quiet right before the real problem happened. And if you think that was already peak creativity, the next story goes even further. Story 3. I watched YouTube and now half the house has no power. One customer called in, sounding extremely frustrated, saying that after adjusting a few very simple things, the entire downstairs suddenly lost power, and the old system clearly had to be the problem. At first, that sounded reasonable. But when the electrician arrived, the scene looked like a DIY project that had gone way too far. Wires had been pulled out and reconnected in complete chaos, with each section done differently, like someone was trying to solve a puzzle while missing half the box. The homeowner explained that they had watched an instructional video online and followed it step by step. The problem was the video had an ad in the middle and they decided to guess the rest on their own. When asked if they were sure they understood everything, they still nodded with complete confidence. Turns out, the only thing that got upgraded that day was the level of damage. And if you think at least they still had their phone working, the next story is going to surprise you even more. Story 4. I don't know why this wire exploded after the customer cut it to check if it had power. An emergency call came in saying there had been a small explosion inside the wall, and the homeowner was pretty sure the electrical system must have already had problems. That sounded reasonable until the electrician started asking a few more questions. It turned out that before making the call, the homeowner had decided to test things personally by taking a pair of scissors and cutting straight into the wire because in their theory, if they cut it and nothing happened, that meant the wire had no power. It sounds like a quick and efficient test, just missing the safety part. When the electrician saw the cut wire and heard the story, he almost did not know where to begin. The homeowner still sounded fairly confident that at least they had confirmed the issue. And technically they did confirm something. Just in a much more expensive way. It was a very fast test, and also a very expensive one. But at least this person only cut a wire. The next one actually brought electricity somewhere it absolutely should not be. Story 5. The customer complained that the outlet outside the bathroom felt unusually dangerous. One person called in sounding both confused and slightly worried, saying that the outlet near the bathroom didn't seem right because every time they used it, it felt more dangerous than normal. That sounded like a serious electrical issue. But when the electrician arrived, everything started to make sense in a very alarming way. Right next to the bathtub was an outdoor power strip with everything plugged into it from a hairdryer and phone charger to a speaker. The homeowner explained that they just wanted things to be convenient and believed that as long as the outlet itself was not directly dipped into water, it was still safe. That sounded less like a safety rule and more like something that they had made up on the spot. The electrician looked at that setup and immediately understood why the dangerous feeling kept showing up so consistently. Some people treat safety warnings like suggestions, not rules. And if you think convenient only goes this far, the next call takes it to a whole new level. Story 6. We just needed a little more length, and then the whole house turned into a maze of electrical cords. One customer complained that the electrical system in the house was not flexible because the outlets were always in the wrong place for where they wanted to put things. That sounded like a normal layout issue. But when the electrician arrived, the scene looked more like a maze map than an electrical system. A whole chain of power strips and extension cords had been connected together, running through the hallway, under the rug behind the sofa, and into the kitchen, like some electrical snake that had lost all sense of direction. The homeowner called it a temporary solution to make daily life more convenient. The interesting part was that this temporary setup had already been there for nearly 2 years. When asked why they had not just had it installed properly, they answered that everything was still working fine. Some things start out as extension cords but end up looking like a low-budget horror movie. And when too many things get plugged into the same place, the next question is usually, why did the power disappear? Story 7. Who killed the power in my house after the customer turned on every appliance at once? One customer called in sounding extremely annoyed, saying the power in the kitchen and living room had just gone out at the same time, and the recently repaired system clearly had to be the problem. At first, that sounded serious, but when the electrician arrived, the story became a lot clearer. The microwave was running, the heater was on full power, the air fryer was going, the coffee maker was working too, and the air conditioner was still trying to carry whatever was left. Everything was plugged into the same area, like a full staff meeting for electrical appliances. When asked about it, the homeowner said they had only turned on the necessary things. Apparently, their definition of necessary included almost the entire house in the same minute. The electrician did not need to inspect much. The problem was already obvious at first glance. And if you think that was enough, the next person actually believed a cheap power strip could handle an entire kitchen. Story 8. The oven would not run and the customer blamed weak electricity. One customer called in, sounding very certain, saying the outlet in the kitchen was obviously too weak, because every time they plugged in the oven, the power started flickering and then shut off. At first, that sounded like a system issue, but when the electrician arrived, everything became much easier to understand. A high-powered oven was plugged into an extension strip so flimsy that it looked wrong just from a distance. The cord was thin, the strip was light, but the job it was being asked to do was enormous. When the electrician pointed out the problem, the homeowner still disagreed because the box clearly said heavy duty. To them, if the packaging said it, then it had to be true. At that point, the laws of physics seemed less important than the words printed on the box. The electrician did not need to do much testing. One look was enough to understand exactly what was happening. And sometimes the problem is not weak electricity. It is confidence placed in the wrong thing. Story 9. My lights are haunted because the living room switch turns on the bathroom light. One customer called in, sounding both irritated and slightly concerned, saying the electrical system in the house had a very strange problem, almost like it had a mind of its own. When they turned on the living room switch, the bathroom light came on. When they turned on the kitchen light, the hallway fan started running. At first, it definitely sounded like something was seriously wrong. But when the electrician came to inspect it, everything was explained very quickly. The homeowner had previously adjusted a few wires to make things neater because the system looked too messy. And during that little cleanup project, they had reconnected the wires according to their own personal logic. The result was that every device in the house started responding, according to a completely new set of rules. When asked about it, they still sounded pretty confident that they had only made everything more organized. In reality, they did not fix the wiring. They created an electrical system that worked like a surprise guessing game. And if you think that was already creative enough, the next story has an even more interesting interpretation of how wires work. Story 10. Wire colors are all basically the same, and then the whole house started protesting. One customer called in, sounding fairly annoyed, saying that after replacing an outlet on their own, a few rooms in the house started acting very emotional with the power coming and going, and that the old system clearly had to be the problem. At first that sounded reasonable, but when the electrician asked whether they had followed the wiring diagram, the answer came back with full confidence. Wire colors are just there to make things easier to look at, so they connected whichever one was closest and most convenient. No rules, no order, just a strong feeling that it was right. When the electrician checked the setup, the whole thing looked more like a random experiment than an actual electrical system. The homeowner still believed they had simply simplified everything. In reality, they did not fix the wiring. They turned it into a form of abstract art. And if you are still feeling calm at this point, the next part will prove that many of these calls start with things even more basic than this. Story 11. The customer complained that the outlet was completely dead, but the switch just had not been turned on. One customer called in, sounding pretty serious, saying the outlet in the living room had completely died overnight and that the electrical system clearly had a problem. At first it sounded like a real issue, but when the electrician arrived, it took him only a few seconds to understand what was going on. He looked around for a moment, then reached over and flipped the wall switch right next to it. Immediately, the outlet started working again as if nothing had ever been wrong. The homeowner stood there slightly surprised, then said that nobody had ever told them an outlet could be connected to a switch. To them, an outlet either worked or it did not. It had nothing to do with that little button on the wall. The electrician did not need to fix a single thing. He just had to take 2 more steps and turn on a switch. Sometimes the hardest part of the job is finding the right button. And at least in this case, the outlet still existed. The next person had actually forgotten the light bulb. Story 12. The customer said the light would not turn on because there was no bulb installed. One customer called in, sounding pretty tense, saying the newly installed ceiling light was completely useless, would not turn on no matter what, and that the system clearly had a problem. At first it sounded like an installation issue, but when the electrician arrived, he only had to look up to understand everything immediately. The light socket was completely empty. There was no bulb installed at all. The homeowner seemed genuinely surprised when asked about the bulb because they thought the fixture came fully built in like a lot of other modern things. To them, the fact that the light would not turn on was obviously a technical failure, not the result of missing the most basic part. The electrician did not need to check the wiring or test the power. He just had to install the one thing that was missing. They called someone out to fix the lighting, but the only missing part was the light itself. And if you think that is as basic as it gets, plenty of people are still ready to ignore the simple parts and demand something more complicated. Story 13. The Wi-Fi must be slow because the electricity is weak. One customer called in with a pretty serious request wanting the entire electrical system checked because the internet in the house had been terribly slow lately. At first that sounded a little strange, but the electrician still came out to take a look. When asked to explain more clearly, the homeowner said that if the electricity flowed stronger, then the Wi-Fi would obviously get faster too, so the problem had to be that the wiring was not powerful enough. The electrician stood there for a few seconds trying to process what he had just heard, then gently explained that he was not the modem's personal doctor and the internet does not work like a light bulb. The homeowner still seemed pretty convinced that something related to electricity was too weak. Sometimes the logic sounds reasonable, right up until you think about it for a few extra seconds. Not everything that uses electricity can be fixed by giving it more electricity. And if you think that was already a major misunderstanding, the next person wants to get rid of the entire concept of wires altogether. Story 14. The customer wanted wireless electricity because they did not like seeing wires. One customer called in with a very clear and confident request. They wanted extra outlets installed in the room, but they did not want the wall opened up, did not want any wires run, and ideally did not want to see anything related to electricity at all. At first it sounded like a minimalist design request, but when the electrician asked what kind of solution they had in mind, the answer came back very calmly. Surely by now there had to be technology that could wirelessly transmit electricity for an entire room. The electrician stood there for a few seconds trying to process that, then explained that electricity does not work like Wi-Fi, and at the moment, there is no way to turn an entire room into an invisible power outlet. The homeowner still believed modern technology should be able to do it. Some expectations sound very up-to-date, but are still far beyond reality. Some people live as if Nikola Tesla is still personally answering a support hotline. And if you think that is the peak, the requests coming next get even harder to believe. Story 15. The customer complained that the light bulbs were all cheap junk because they kept burning out. One homeowner called in sounding pretty frustrated, insisting that the electrical system in the house was destroying light bulbs because they were having to replace them almost every month. At first that sounded like a voltage issue, but when the electrician checked, the problem came down to one very simple detail. The homeowner was using bulbs with a higher wattage than the fixture allowed, but still believed that as long as the base fit, it was fine to use. To them, if the size matched, then everything else had to be okay. In reality, the bulbs could not handle that setup, so they kept burning out. When it was explained to them, they still looked pretty surprised, as if this were brand new information. They were not buying the wrong light bulbs. They were just repeating the same mistake every month like a subscription nobody asked for. And if you think that was only a misunderstanding about a device, the next story is a misunderstanding about the whole house. Story 16. The customer used the breaker panel like a reset button for everything. One customer called in sounding pretty exhausted, saying the electrical system in the house was very unstable because almost every day they had to go to the panel and flip things off and on a few times before everything felt normal again. At first, that sounded like an annoying issue, but when the electrician looked into it more closely, the truth turned out to be surprisingly simple. Whenever the TV lagged, the doorbell stopped ringing, or the coffee maker responded slowly, the homeowner would go straight to the electrical panel and reset the whole thing like they were restarting a frozen app. To them, that was the fastest solution to every problem. The electrician had to explain that not everything needs to be turned off and back on again to work better. But the homeowner still believed that method worked. Some people treat the breaker panel like life's universal retry button. And when they do not understand the panel, they also tend not to like the things that were installed correctly in the first place. Story 17. This outlet is broken because the plug goes in too tight. One customer called in sounding slightly annoyed, saying the newly installed outlet had a problem because every time they plugged something in, they had to use a fair amount of force and it did not feel smooth like the old one. At first it sounded like a product defect, but when the electrician checked it, everything was completely normal. The new outlet was firm, had good contact, and met proper safety standards. The real issue was somewhere else. The homeowner had gotten so used to the old loose outlet that the plug was basically staying in place through faith and a little bit of luck. When they switched to the new one, that tighter feel got mistaken for a problem. To them, the easier it was to plug in, the more correct it felt. The electrician had to explain that a firm connection is exactly what you want. Sometimes the thing that bothers us is not the new standard. It is the fact that the old one had lowered the standard for so long. And if you think that was only a small misunderstanding, the next person is about to make the idea of normal feel very flexible. Story 18. The customer reported a power outage only in their house while the entire neighborhood was completely dark. A late-night emergency call came in saying that the entire system in my house just went down and demanding that an electrician come immediately because the situation was very serious. At first, that sounded genuinely alarming, but as the electrician drove closer to the area, he noticed one very obvious detail. It was not just this house. The entire street was dark. There were no lights on, no signs of electricity working in any of the surrounding homes. When asked about it, the homeowner seemed pretty surprised because they had not looked outside the window before making the call. To them, losing power in their house automatically meant a personal emergency that needed immediate attention. In reality, the problem was happening on a much larger scale. Some people get so focused on their own space that they forget to check the world around them. And from this point on, the requests start sounding less like repair jobs and more like expectations that have wandered completely outside reality. Story 19. The customer wanted the lights brighter but did not want to use more electricity. One customer called in with a request that sounded very reasonable at first. The living room was too dark and needed to be brighter. But the second half was the memorable part. They wanted that to happen without increasing the electric bill. At first, it sounded more like a challenge than a repair job. When the electrician asked whether they wanted stronger bulbs, additional lights, or some kind of system adjustment, the answer to all of it was no. They did not want to change anything that already existed. They just wanted the room to somehow become brighter through a smart solution. The electrician stood there for a few seconds, trying to find a polite way to explain that light does not work according to that kind of wish. Some requests sound perfectly reasonable, right up until you look at the conditions attached to them. Some electrical service calls are really just applications to bend reality. And if you think that is already absurd, the next person actually complained about the exact thing they had asked for. Story 20. The customer complained the newly installed wire was too long after personally asking for it to be extended as much as possible. One customer called back after the work was finished, saying the newly installed wire looked way too long and very annoying and was ruining the look of the room. At first, that sounded like an installation mistake, but when the electrician checked the job notes, everything became much clearer. The homeowner had specifically asked earlier for the wire to be made longer than usual so furniture could be moved around later without needing another repair. When reminded of that, they hesitated for a moment, then said I was thinking differently back then. Now that they could actually see the extra length, they wanted it to look short and neat like the original setup. The interesting part was that they still hoped the mistake belonged to the installer, not to their own earlier decision. For some people, the problem is not the result. It is the fact that the result looks exactly like what they asked for, and from this point on, things do not just get unreasonable. They start turning into conflict. Story 21. The customer fixed it themselves, broke half the system, then called to ask, "How did you even install this?" One homeowner called in, sounding irritated, saying half the house had just lost power after they had only replaced one very simple switch, and that the original system clearly had to be the problem. At first, that sounded reasonable, but when the electrician arrived and checked things out, the truth looked very different. It was not just one switch. Several wires had been removed, reconnected in the wrong places, and then covered back up like nothing had ever happened. The homeowner explained that they had simply followed what felt logical and could not understand why everything had stopped working. What stood out most was that they still opened by blaming the original design. The electrician did not just have to fix the fault. He had to retrace everything that had been done wrong. Some people create the entire crime scene and still talk like they were only the one who discovered it. And sometimes it does not take much skill at all to create a very big problem. Story 22. The washing machine had an electrical failure because it was not plugged in. One customer called in, sounding pretty certain, saying the outlet in the laundry room had completely lost power because the washing machine would not start no matter what. At first, that sounded like a serious electrical issue. But when the electrician arrived, he only had to bend down behind the machine to understand the problem immediately. The power cord was sitting there neatly, not plugged into anything at all. Not loose, not burned, just simply not connected. When asked about it, the homeowner explained that they thought when the machine was pushed back against the wall, it would automatically go into the right position. That sounded like an automatic feature that has never existed. The electrician did not need to inspect the system or test the power. He just had to plug it in, and immediately everything started working normally. It was not an electrical issue. It was too much faith and convenience. And if you think that was enough, the next story has an electrical sound coming from a very different place. Story 23. The customer heard a sound from the outlet, but the real culprit was a Bluetooth speaker. One customer called in, sounding pretty panicked, saying they kept hearing a faint buzzing sound near the outlet and believed the electrical system was about to have a serious problem. At first, it absolutely sounded like something that should be checked right away. But when the electrician arrived, it took him less than a minute to find the culprit. A Bluetooth speaker sitting on the nearby shelf was making a low battery warning sound, steady and very clear. When it was pointed out, the homeowner still did not fully believe it, because to them, the sound felt more electrical. The electrician had to turn the speaker on and off a few times just to prove where the sound was coming from. At that point, everything became clear, just not in the way they had originally expected. There were no sparks, no burning wires, just a speaker that needed to be charged. Sometimes the only thing overloaded in the room is the imagination. And if you think that is the peak, the next story gets a lot more dangerous. Story 24. The customer wanted the voltage increased so the phone would charge faster. One customer called in with a very serious question. Can you make this outlet a little stronger? At first that sounded a little strange, but the electrician asked a few more questions anyway. The homeowner explained that their phone was charging too slowly, so the outlet probably was not strong enough. To them, if the voltage were increased just a little, everything would charge faster, like turning up the flow of water from a faucet. The electrician had to spend a few minutes explaining that outlets do not work that way and that increasing the electricity is not a safe or reasonable option. The homeowner still seemed pretty convinced that there had to be some way to make the electricity move faster. Some ideas sound very convenient, right up until you understand how dangerous they really are. Some people look at an entire house like one giant fast charger just waiting to be unlocked. And if you think that was enough, the next story goes even further beyond logic. Story 25. The customer reported that the yard lights were not working. In broad daylight, one customer called in sounding pretty irritated, saying the newly installed yard lights would not turn on at all, and that the electrician had obviously done a sloppy job. At first it sounded like an installation issue, but when the electrician arrived, it was the middle of the day with bright sunlight covering everything. After a few seconds of looking around, he realized these were lights with a daylight sensor, which meant they were only supposed to turn on when it got dark. So the fact that they were not working during the day was completely normal. When this was explained, the homeowner still looked slightly disappointed, as if they had expected the lighting system to somehow overpower the sun. The electrician did not need to fix a thing. He only had to explain one very basic principle. Sometimes the job is not about fixing electricity. It is about explaining how the world works. And if you think that was simple, the next person blames electricity for a problem created entirely by their own choice. Story 26. The customer said the electricity in the house was getting weaker because they were using cheap extension cords. One customer called in sounding pretty certain, saying the electricity in the house had clearly gotten weaker lately because the appliances were no longer working as powerfully as before. At first that sounded like a system issue, but when the electrician checked, the real story was somewhere else. Most of the appliances were plugged into thin, cheap, aging extension cords to the point that the cords themselves had become the bottleneck. When the electrician pointed this out, the homeowner still did not want to replace them because in their view, those cords were still usable. Apparently, the definition of usable here was more emotional than technical. The electrician did not need to fix the system. He just needed to replace the thing that was actually causing the problem. A lot of people are very focused on saving money right up until they have to pay an electrician to confirm they were saving money in the wrong place. And if you think that was enough, the next level of confidence is about to enter a very different zone. Story 27. The customer asked where to replace the batteries in an LED bulb. One customer called in very calmly asking if the LED bulb in the kitchen had run out of batteries and where exactly they should open it to replace them properly. At first it sounded like a technical question, just heading in a very creative direction. The electrician had to pause for a few seconds to choose the gentlest way to explain, then said that LED bulbs do not run on batteries like a TV remote. The homeowner went quiet for a moment, processing that, then asked if the battery must be hidden in the ceiling, and they just had not found the access point yet. At that point, the electrician basically had to start over from the most basic concept. Some calls do not break anything at all, but still make you feel like you just missed a very important class. There was nothing wrong with the light bulb. The understanding of it was just a little creative. And if you think that is a small misunderstanding, the next story starts with plugging something in the wrong way from the very beginning. Story 28. The customer used the wrong plug type and then concluded the outlet was broken. One customer called in, sounding pretty certain, saying the newly installed outlet was clearly defective because the device they had just bought could not be plugged into it. At first it sounded like an installation problem, but when the electrician checked, everything was completely normal. The outlet was the correct standard and had been installed properly. The problem was with the plug because it belonged to a completely different standard. When this was explained, the homeowner still disagreed, arguing that if a device was bought in this day and age, it should work everywhere. To them, the fact that it did not fit had to be the outlet's fault, not the device's. The electrician had to explain more about different standards in different regions, but it was not an easy sell. Some logic sounds completely reasonable right up until you look at where it came from. And if you think that was already a major misunderstanding, the next person actually installed the whole system wrong and still felt very confident about it. Story 29. The customer installed everything their own way and still insisted the old system was the real problem. One homeowner called in with a long list of strange issues from flickering lights to outlets that worked sometimes and not others, and confidently insisted that the house had a problem at the foundation. At first it sounded like an aging electrical system, but when the electrician checked, almost everything had already been tampered with: new outlets, new switches, new wire connections, all installed in a very creative way. There was no diagram, no standard, just a strong feeling that it looked logical. When it was explained that those exact changes were causing the issues, the homeowner still seemed pretty confident and said, "But it still looks right." To them, if everything looked balanced, then it should obviously work. Some people judge an electrical system the same way they judge wall art. As long as it looks fine, that must be enough. And if you think that is the highest level this goes, the next person actually wants electricity to do the air conditioner's job. Story 30. The customer wanted a refund because the electricity was fixed, but the house is still hot. One customer called in very seriously demanding a refund because after the electrical work was done, the house was still just as hot and clearly the service did not fully solve the problem. At first, that sounded confusing. But when the electrician asked a few more questions, he realized the homeowner had grouped the electrical system, the air conditioner, the fan, and the general discomfort of summer into one single issue. To them, if the electricity was fixed, the house should also feel cooler. When it was explained that electricity does not directly lower temperature, the homeowner still looked dissatisfied because if it's fixed, it should improve everything. The electrician stood there for a few seconds, trying to find a way to explain that without making things more tense. Sometimes, the job is not just fixing a system, it is explaining the limits of reality. And if you think that is the peak, the final story starts with damage and ends with a threat to sue. Story 31. The customer broke the system themselves, then threatened to sue the electrician. One customer called in absolutely furious, saying the entire electrical system after the previous repair was worse than ever and that they were considering legal action. At first that sounded pretty serious, but when the electrician arrived and took a closer look, the story became much clearer. The electrical panel had been opened, wires had been moved, and several connections were no longer the way they were after the last repair. In other words, after everything had been properly fixed, the homeowner had gone in, made their own changes, created new problems, and then called back as if the issue had appeared on its own. When asked about it, they still sounded confident, saying they had just taken a quick look. The electrician not only had to fix the new damage, but also explain what had actually happened. Some people are not just wrong, they are so confident that they believe the mistake must belong to someone else. And that is when you realize this job does not just require skill, it requires patience. 31 complaints, and somehow the person who still has to come fix all of it is always the electrician. The funny part is not that they were wrong, it is that they were wrong with the kind of confidence that makes you wonder whether electricity should be apologizing to them. If you have ever met someone like, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing," and then right after that, everything went dark, tell that story in the comments. Hit like if this video suddenly made you respect electricians a whole lot more, and share this with the person who always says, "Let me do it myself." Subscribe because trust me, there are still plenty more stories out there and they get even worse.